Along the eastern edge of Toronto's harbour, rising from the windswept industrial portlands, stands a colossal monument of brick, concrete, and weathered steel, the Richard L. Hearn Generating Station. For more than 7 decades, this industrial monolith has commanded the waterfront, crowned by a solitary concrete smokestack climbing 215 meters into the northern sky, a height rivaling Toronto's tallest financial towers and visible across the expanse of Lake Ontario. With a cavernous interior large enough to swallow multiple athletic stadiums, the facility once stood as the largest thermal power station in Canada, built to fuel the explosive post-war expansion of Ontario. Inside its chained perimeter, the sheer physical scale remains staggering. The central turbine hall stretches hundreds of meters beneath towering steel trusses, once housing 8 synchronized turbo generators capable of pumping 1,200 megawatts of continuous power into the provincial grid, enough, in its prime, to supply more than a third of Toronto's peak electrical demand. Massive overhead traveling cranes hang frozen from ceiling girders, rust scales across 5-story boiler framing, and deep subterranean intake tunnels sit flooded beneath the concrete foundations. Today, this former powerhouse stands in total darkness. Its control panels sit stripped, its massive hall is silent, and its rusted bulk rests directly opposite the glittering multi-billion-dollar skyline of North America's fastest-growing metropolis. From across the harbour, the silence exposes a startling contradiction. Conceived as an unshakable shield against regional blackouts, this public mega-project burned through its operational lifespan in just a few decades, falling silent and left to rust in plain view of the city it was built to save. The station was born out of a post-war emergency. In the years immediately following the Second World War, Toronto was expanding at a pace that threatened to overwhelm its civic infrastructure. Soldiers returning from overseas were starting families, waves of new immigrants were arriving weekly, and agricultural fields were transforming into modern suburbs like Don Mills, Etobicoke, and Scarborough. At the same time, Ontario's manufacturing sector was operating around the clock, producing automobiles, steel, and consumer appliances. Every new suburban household demanded refrigerators, electric ranges, and water heaters, driving electricity demand upward at 7 to 8% annually. For 50 years, Ontario Hydro built its identity entirely around water. Guided by Sir Adam Beck's motto, "The gifts of nature are for the public," the province relied on clean hydroelectricity from Niagara Falls and the river systems of the Canadian Shield. But by the late 1940s, that hydraulic miracle hit a hard physical ceiling. Every economically viable waterfall within transmission reach of Toronto had already been dammed. When severe post-war winter droughts dramatically reduced regional river flows, the provincial grid buckled under the industrial load. Ontario plunged into a sweeping power emergency. Municipalities dimmed streetlights, commercial window displays were banned after dark, factory shifts were forced into the middle of the night, and scheduled rolling brownouts left entire city blocks in blackness. Faced with economic paralysis, Ontario Hydro's general manager and chief engineer, Richard L. Hearn, made an unprecedented decision. Breaking with decades of hydro-only tradition, Hearn persuaded provincial leaders to construct a massive coal-fired thermal station directly in Toronto's portlands. Positioned next to deep water shipping channels and the city's dense electrical load centers, this thermal plant was designed to generate thousands of megawatts of baseload energy right where the city needed it most. When the Richard L. Hearn Generating Station fired its initial boilers in October 1951, it started with a pair of 100-megawatt turbine generators, but Toronto's hunger for power quickly outstripped those early projections. Between 1956 and 1961, Ontario Hydro carried out a massive expansion, installing 4 colossal 200-megawatt machines alongside the original units. When completed, the Hearn housed 8 steam turbine generators delivering a nameplate capacity of 1,200 megawatts, making it the largest thermal electric generating station in Canada, and an engineering marvel of its era. Operating at this scale required an unrelenting logistical pipeline. Great Lakes bulk freighters docked along the Portland's ship channel day and night, unloading millions of tons of bituminous coal mined from the Appalachian basins of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. At peak winter capacity, the station devoured 10,000 tons of coal every 24 hours. Mechanical conveyors carried this continuous stream of fuel into overhead bunkers, where massive ball mills pulverized the solid rock into a powder as fine as talcum dust. Blown with preheated air into multi-story combustion chambers, this coal dust ignited into infernos topping 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Miles of internal tubing converted millions of gallons of water into superheated steam at extreme pressure, screaming into the turbine casings to spin generator rotors at 3,600 revolutions per minute. Subterranean intake channels drew hundreds of thousands of gallons of freezing Lake Ontario water through condenser banks, recycling the steam back into boiler feed. The Hearne operated as a roaring industrial powerhouse, keeping Toronto's manufacturing economy running around the clock. Yet burning 10,000 tons of coal daily directly on the edge of a booming downtown core was about to trigger an environmental collision the city could not ignore. By the late 1960s, the station's relentless coal consumption was exacting a heavy environmental toll on Toronto. Operating without modern flue gas scrubbers or high-efficiency precipitators, the station discharged tens of thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and fly ash into the urban atmosphere every month. Prevailing lake breezes carried the dense plumes straight into East End working-class neighborhoods like Leslieville, Riverdale, and the Beach. For surrounding residents, the fallout was impossible to escape. Mornings brought layers of what locals termed black snow, a dark soot settling across front porches, laundry lines, and vegetable gardens. Acidic fallout damaged vehicle finishes and corroded metal roofs, while childhood asthma and respiratory complaints surged across the East End. Toronto newspapers ran front-page exposés on industrial smog, citizen groups staged rallies against Ontario Hydro, and the provincial government passed strict new limits under the Air Pollution Control Act and the 1971 Environmental Protection Act. Ontario Hydro was caught in an operational vice. Shutting the Hearne down would eliminate 1,200 megawatts of indispensable power, but continuing to operate violated ground-level pollution laws. The utility's answer was not to reduce emissions, but to change where they landed. Guided by the era's common engineering doctrine, the solution to pollution is dilution, Hydro launched a $9 million structural gambit. Between 1970 and 1971, crews demolished the station's 4 original smokestacks and poured a single, continuous reinforced concrete superstack, rising 215 meters above the waterfront. It was one of the tallest freestanding smokestacks on the planet. The logic was simple: eject hot sulfur dioxide high into atmospheric jet streams, scattering the emissions across hundreds of kilometers of distant countryside and northern forests before they could touch Toronto soil. The concrete superstack brought temporary compliance, but even as the concrete set, tectonic shifts in Ontario's energy strategy were already making the entire coal station obsolete. The 215-meter superstack had barely begun venting exhaust before a fundamental revolution in provincial energy policy undermined the entire facility. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, Ontario Hydro committed heavily to nuclear energy, pioneering the CANDU reactor design. When the multi-unit Pickering Nuclear Generating Station went online east of Toronto in 1971, followed by the Bruce Complex on Lake Huron, provincial grid economics changed fundamentally. While nuclear stations required substantial upfront capital to build, their ongoing fuel costs were remarkably low, making them ideal for uninterrupted baseload generation. Coal facilities like the Hearne were pushed into expensive peaking roles, firing up during sudden demand spikes and idling when load dropped. In an attempt to adapt and calm lingering air quality concerns, Ontario Hydro converted 5 of the Hearne's 8 boilers to burn clean natural gas piped from Western Canada, eliminating sulfur dioxide and ash emissions. That environmental retrofit quickly turned into an economic trap. The global energy shocks of 1973 and 1979 caused natural gas prices to surge dramatically, while seasonal delivery bottlenecks restricted supply. Operating the Hearn on natural gas became financially unsustainable, forcing engineers into an expensive cycle of alternating between costly gas and heavily regulated coal. Squeezed between expensive fossil fuels and cheap, round-the-clock nuclear baseload, the plant could no longer compete. In July 1983, Ontario Hydro permanently extinguished the Hearn's boilers, ending commercial thermal generation. For the next 12 years, the station survived in a specialized secondary role. 3 generator rotors were uncoupled from their steam turbines and operated as synchronous condensers, freewheeling electromagnetically to stabilize voltage and regulate reactive power across downtown Toronto's grid. When modern solid-state capacitor banks made mechanical condensers obsolete in 1995, the switches were opened for good, plunging the station into darkness. Today, the Richard L. Hearn Generating Station sits as a silent, heavily secured fortress on more than 50 acres of prime waterfront real estate in a Portlands district currently undergoing one of the largest urban redevelopments in North American history. It resembles a preserved industrial heritage site, but the reality is a financial and environmental deadlock. The plant remains standing because demolition represents an unpayable toxic liability. Beneath its brick shell lies extensive industrial contamination. Decades of heavy thermal generation left the interior saturated with thousands of tons of friable chrysotile and amosite asbestos, coating steam lines, boiler casings, and structural steel throughout the turbine hall. The underlying ground is contaminated with heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium, along with carcinogenic PCBs from aging transformer infrastructure. Attempting mechanical demolition in a dense harbor corridor risks releasing hazardous airborne fibers into adjacent neighborhoods and washing toxins into Lake Ontario. Complete hazardous abatement and site remediation is projected to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, far exceeding the market value of the land itself. Over the past 3 decades, grand redevelopment proposals, from professional sports arenas and indoor ski facilities to high-end film production campuses, have uniformly collapsed once developers faced the true remediation arithmetic. Instead, the Hearn exists as an eerie industrial soundstage, its rusted interior serving as a dystopian backdrop for Hollywood productions like Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim, RoboCop, and Star Trek Discovery. The silence along Toronto's waterfront reveals the true life cycle of heavy energy infrastructure. Long after the boilers go cold and the electrical grid moves on, the physical footprint, toxic contamination, and financial liabilities do not vanish. They remain locked within the rusted steel and concrete, a permanent debt waiting on the shoreline. Subscribe to Rusted Empire for more cinematic stories of the empires left to rust.